First Crimea, then the rest of Ukraine. That had been Putin's plan since 2014, as he saw Crimea as the starting point of his invasion. It all started with Crimea, and now it's going to end with Crimea. Something has suddenly changed on the peninsula, and it's shattered every plan that Putin ever made. The bastion of Russian power in Ukraine is no more. Bit by bit, Crimea is being liberated by Ukraine, and the sudden change we're seeing now has made the peninsula more vulnerable than ever before. When Putin launched his invasion, illegally occupied Crimea was seen as a vital point of the Russian plan. Supplies from mainland Russia could be shipped into the peninsula via the Kerch Bridge, for which Russia spent between $3 billion and $5 billion to build. Those supplies would then be shipped from Crimea into Ukraine, plus all of the hardware that Putin has installed on the peninsula could be used to strike Ukraine from afar. It was all so simple. Crimea would be the linchpin for Russia's entire approach to eastern Ukraine. But even the best-laid plans can crumble around you when you underestimate your enemy, and Putin has been doing that ever since 2014. Ukraine knew how Putin intended to use Crimea from the moment that Russia took the peninsula. And though what Ukraine has been doing to Russia in Crimea has grabbed plenty of headlines since 2022, the reality is that Ukraine has been preparing and building on a campaign to retake Crimea bit by bit from Russia almost since the peninsula was annexed. As the National Interest reports, as far back as 2016, Ukrainian intelligence had been pushing for more aggressive action against the Russian occupation. The US should get involved to push Russia out, Ukraine argued. The US said no. That was a red line that the US wasn't willing to cross, as it feared escalation from Russia. So Ukraine took matters into its own hands. A Ukrainian military intelligence team, likely led by the man who has now become the head of the Ukrainian presidential office, Kirill Budanov, organized a covert raid on Crimea in August 2016. Lasting from August 6th to 8th, the operation involved a group of 5 special forces officers who landed on Crimea's western coast to deliver explosives and other materials to a specially designated location near Russian facilities on the peninsula. Those facilities had been chosen because Ukraine correctly identified that Russia would try to use them in a later invasion. Unfortunately for Ukraine, the raid wasn't successful. A member of Budanov's team was discovered, and Ukraine had to retreat, though a direct clash ended up leaving several Russian personnel dead. Ukraine was lambasted by both the US and Russia for its actions. Then Vice President of the US, Joe Biden, reportedly warned Ukraine that nothing like this could ever happen again. As for Putin, smug in his belief that the raid had exposed Ukraine's weakness, he claimed that Russia would not let such things slide by. What Putin didn't realize was that Ukraine had sent a clear message with this raid. Ukraine wasn't going to give up on Crimea. August 2016's raid may have been a failure, but it set the stage for a chain of events that have weakened Putin's grip on Crimea. The sudden change that is happening right now is the result of that sequence of events. The impact that this change has had on Russia has left Putin with 2 terrible choices: lose Crimea or lose the invasion of the Ukrainian mainland. Let's fast forward to February 2022. The full-scale invasion that Ukraine always knew was coming officially begins, and Putin still thought that he held all of the cards in Crimea. Arrogant beyond belief, Putin thought that Russia had absorbed Ukraine's best shot on the peninsula 6 years earlier. As Russian soldiers were marauding through southern and eastern Ukraine, Crimea would be practically untouchable. Ukraine had no real navy to speak of. The Black Sea Fleet patrolled the waters that gave the fleet its name, and the one land-based route into Crimea could only be invaded if Ukraine was willing to lose tens, if not hundreds of thousands of its soldiers by deliberately sending them into a lethal bottleneck. Equipment and troops were hurtling across the Kerch Bridge and into Crimea to move on into Ukraine, and every plan that Putin had made seemed to be going well. Then, everything changed. The Kerch Bridge, Putin's monument to Russia's supposed success in Crimea, became a target for a nation with no real navy. On a chilly fall morning in October 2022, everything seemed to be business as usual on the 12-mile bridge that typically saw traffic of about 15,000 vehicles per day. The early morning traffic was light, though it would have increased over the course of the day. We say would have because Ukraine had other plans. As a large train carrying fuel hurtled toward Crimea, a truck exploded on the Kerch Bridge. Captured by CCTV, the explosion happened at 6:07 a.m. local time, and it tore through the Russian train. Fuel tanks were ruptured by the white-hot fireball that had engulfed them, a road carriageway fell to pieces, and a pillar was destroyed. Ukraine had just hit the Kerch Bridge. And Russia hadn't seen it coming. Lessons had been learned from August 2016, and in an instant, Ukraine had shown Putin that he had a lot more to worry about from Ukraine's military intelligence than he thought. And in the years that have followed, the Kerch Bridge has been targeted several more times. A follow-up attack in 2023 rocked the bridge. 2 years later, Ukraine's security service managed to install underwater explosives on the Kerch Bridge supports in an operation that lasted for several months. Those devices exploded in June 2025, sending yet another message to Putin that he couldn't protect the bridge that means everything to him. Then on May 4, 2026, the news broke that Ukrainian sea drones had taken out an entire FSB boat crew guarding the Kerch Bridge, a setup for a future attack. Russia can only wonder, and Ukraine is more than happy to let the paranoia grow as 9 of Russia's sailors are buried. What the repeated strikes on the Kerch Bridge have shown Putin is that his grip on Crimea is not as absolute as he believed it to be. The country with no real navy is hitting a bridge that helps Russia transport its soldiers and supplies over the water, and that's something that was never supposed to happen. Crimea, as a tool for the invasion of mainland Ukraine, has been compromised. But hey, Putin would have thought, at least Russia still has the Black Sea Fleet. Except it doesn't exactly. Using missiles, aerial drones, and ever-improving maritime drones, Ukraine has wreaked havoc on the Russian warships that are supposed to be guarding all seaborne routes into Crimea. About a third of the Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed by Ukraine, with the rest having withdrawn from its traditional base in Crimea's Sevastopol port. Russia's ships now hide away in Novorossiysk, where they're used for little more than long-range strikes against Ukraine, having failed to take control over the Black Sea. Another piece of the Crimea liberation puzzle has fallen into place due to Ukraine's Black Sea campaign. The waterways are more open than they've ever been before, which only makes Crimea even more vulnerable. As secure as Putin thought his plan would be, Ukraine was following through on a plan of its own. The National Interest points out that Ben Hodges, who is a former commander of the US Army forces in Europe, had highlighted what Ukraine's plan should be right from the outset. Crimea should first be isolated. Then it should be made unusable for Russia as a military sanctuary. This is precisely what Ukraine has spent the last few years doing. Taking out the Black Sea Fleet means that seaborne passage to and from Crimea via the Black Sea is now a no-go. The attacks on the Kerch Bridge have left Russia with no other choice but to stop using that multi-billion-dollar monument to Putin's arrogance to ship military equipment into Crimea. As far back as May 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia was no longer using the Kerch Bridge to keep its frontline troops supplied. Ukraine's attacks had made doing so too much of a risk. Isolation has happened. Now comes the sudden change that has flipped Putin's plans for Crimea on its head. With the peninsula mostly isolated, Ukraine is following through on the second part of Hodges' plan by making the peninsula totally useless to Russia as a military asset. How? Well, Crimean air defenses are being destroyed at an astonishing rate, and that sets up Russia for a world of pain. But before we dig deeper into that, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If you're getting insight from the channel, remember to subscribe so you catch more of our videos. As it whittled away at the Black Sea Fleet and made the use of the Kerch Bridge untenable, Ukraine has pursued a broader campaign to destroy the air defenses that Putin has set up in Crimea. Drone and missile strikes target everything. Logistical nodes, radar systems, and entire air defense batteries are burning almost weekly in Crimea, as Ukraine works to reduce the density of the layered air defenses that Russia has set up on the peninsula. Monthly massacres of Russia's air defenses are now commonplace, and March provided the perfect example. In an April 15th report, UKR Inform noted that Ukrainian attacks on occupied Crimea and elsewhere in the occupied territories had destroyed 54 of Russia's air defense units, broken down into 15 radars and 39 surface-to-air missile launchers. March 9th alone had brought with it a strike that shattered a pair of Crimean radomes, along with a Nebo-U radar system and a 5N84A Oberona 14 radar. That is just a sample. Ukraine has been targeting air defenses for a long time. Every strike in Crimea itself weakens the protection that Putin has put in place. And when Ukraine takes out air defenses in the occupied territories to the east and south, it opens up safe aerial corridors that it can use to send yet more drones and missiles Crimea's way. And that is the sudden change. Crimea is now open to attacks almost at will, as the gaps are in place that allow Ukraine to strike. A professor of political science at the National University of Kyiv Malaya Academy, Taras Kuzio, lays the strategy out. Ukraine is destroying Russian air defenses everywhere, not just Crimea, to create safe passage corridors for medium and long-range strikes behind Russian lines. That second part of the statement is as much of a problem for Putin as Ukraine's degradation of Crimea itself. As the Crimean air defenses fall one by one, Ukraine can send its powerful long-range drones, such as the Flamingo, over Crimea and into Russia itself. What was meant to be a pillar of protection for all of Russia has become an isolated and increasingly useless peninsula. Ukraine has also been smart in its approach. Ukraine's military intelligence, or HUR, has made a name for itself by taking out air defense systems in Crimea. In particular, the Ghosts unit has specialized in destroying the best that Russia has to offer, including S-300, S-400, and Buk air defense systems. Precision strikes have become the Ghosts' go-to, and those strikes are smart. Taking out air defense batteries is one thing, but the constant targeting of radar systems in Crimea is what's really damaging Putin's hold on the peninsula. Why? Well, radars are expensive and difficult to build. That was the case even before Putin launched his invasion. But now Russia is creaking under the weight of Western sanctions that make it more difficult and expensive for it to source the parts that it needs to build replacement radars. With the radars gone, entire air defense batteries become useless. They can't fire at what they can't see, which leaves Putin and his cronies devastated as they watch Ukrainian drones fly over helpless air defense systems sitting next to destroyed radars. The gaps are now in play. The sudden change has been completed. Now Ukraine can lean into its brilliant strategy for Crimea even more. HUR continues to target Crimea along with Ukraine's unmanned systems forces. In March and April, Ukraine conducted 76 strikes against Russian air defenses in Crimea and the occupied territory, breaking down to 39 strikes in March and 37 in April. The previous 2 months had seen Ukraine launch almost 50 such strikes, as it's increased the number of its attacks against Russian air defenses by around 300% since the end of 2025. Crimea is the largest focus for Ukraine when taking on the occupied territories. Across the 173 geolocated and confirmed strikes that Ukraine carried out against Russia in those territories, 100 occurred in Crimea, the Tochny Collective reports. The same collective also makes note that Ukraine has been focusing on degrading Crimea's air defenses since early 2025, and that its campaign has ramped up as we approach the midpoint of 2026. What we're seeing with this intensified approach is that Putin has no answer for what Ukraine is doing in Crimea. It's simple. If Russia could do anything about these attacks, it would. But we're seeing more of Crimea's air defenses get crippled month by month, and it's only going to get worse for Russia from here. These sorts of attacks feed into the second part of Hodge's plan, which is to make Crimea militarily useless for Russia. But Ukraine is taking things further. Beyond forcing Putin to relinquish his control over Crimea with its constant strikes as it works toward liberation, Ukraine is now using Crimea's weakness to enable strikes deeper into Russia. On top of that, Crimea's offensive potential is being whittled away. Drones and missiles are fired from the peninsula into Ukraine. As more air defenses crumble, the sites and infrastructure used to make those launches possible become targets. We're already starting to see that happen. On April 2nd, the news broke that Ukraine had struck an airfield in Crimea, taking out an Orion drone base and an AN-72P aircraft in the process. Toward the end of April, Ukraine's special forces struck an Iskander missile storage facility in Crimea. None of this would have been possible if it weren't for the sudden change in Russia's air defense posture. The protection is down, and the rest of Putin's military hardware in Crimea has become fair game. So where does Putin's hold over Crimea stand right now? Russia still controls the peninsula, of course, but that control is slipping. The Kerch Bridge has been made practically useless from a military perspective, and the Black Sea Fleet that was supposed to deploy from Crimea has instead sailed as far away from the peninsula as it can get. But it's the air defense problem that is the real kicker for Russia. Air defense batteries, radars, and the equipment that they protect are burning to the ground, and that leaves Putin with a real dilemma: feed or abandon. If Putin is going to be able to hold on to Crimea, he has to do it by feeding more of the systems that Ukraine is destroying into Crimea. That requires pulling the systems either from the occupied territories or from within Russia itself. These systems are valuable and, as Ukraine has proven time and time again, extremely vulnerable. An air defense radar that is shipped to Crimea today becomes a target for Ukraine tomorrow, and it's not like Russia is building more systems to replace those that it's losing in Crimea. Russia is struggling to build anything that requires high-tech components, from radars to missiles, which means that most hardware that heads into Crimea is pulled from stockpiles. Eventually, the stockpiles will run out, and Crimea will be left defenseless against Ukraine's strikes anyway. The second option for Putin is to abandon Crimea entirely, at least in terms of it being a strategic logistics and weapons base. That would make Crimea functionally useless when it comes to aiding the invasion of mainland Ukraine, but it would at least mean that hardware that is simply being churned up on the peninsula might survive a little longer in Russia or the other occupied territories. The big downside here is that refusing to replace Crimea's shattered defenses leaves the 800,000 or so Russian citizens who have migrated to Crimea since the annexation, along with tens of thousands of Russian soldiers on the peninsula, completely isolated. Are any of them going to want to stay when they know that Ukraine's drones and missiles can strike at will? Whether he feeds or abandons Crimea, Putin cripples his war effort. He either sets Crimea up for eventual liberation, or he hurts his forces elsewhere to carry on protecting territory that Ukraine will hit anyway. The ultimate irony is now slapping Putin right around the face. Crimea, which is where the war against Ukraine truly began, is now looking like the place where it will end. And interestingly, there is one man who saw all of this coming. In August 2022, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the Crimea platform and spoke about Ukraine's intention to liberate Crimea, and there was something specific that Zelensky said that caught our attention. And I want to emphasize, for Ukraine, Crimea is not just some territory, not a chip in the geopolitical game, as for a terrorist state. For Ukraine, Crimea is part of our people, our society, a community of people to whom we will guarantee freedom and restore modernity, Zelensky declared. Ukraine told Russia exactly what it planned to do from the very start. Crimea was never going to be handed over. Now we're seeing Zelensky and Ukraine follow through on the promises made in August 2022. Putin's grip on the peninsula he snatched back in 2014 has never been weaker, and with the sudden change that has led to Ukraine shattering Crimea's air defenses, it's only a matter of time before the territory that was supposed to be Putin's trump card is where Russia will eventually lose the war with Ukraine. Total liberation of Crimea has begun. Ukraine's master plan is well underway, and there is nothing that Putin can do to stop it. All that Ukraine is doing now is geared toward doing one thing that will take occupied Crimea out of the war completely: the complete destruction of the Kerch Bridge. You can find out more about that and the rest of Ukraine's plan by watching our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show to see more of our coverage of Ukraine's strategy for its annexed peninsula. And thank you as always for watching.